Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. News of the day, Vladimir Putin has announced a so-called partial mobilization of the Russian state with a view to raising hundreds of thousands of new troops to prolong and extend the illegal war in Ukraine. This is in response, of course, to the failed objectives of the Russian military. They have failed to take Kiev. They have been losing in the east of Ukraine. The Kharkiv offensive cost them thousands of square kilometers of territory. And it's obvious at this point that Russia does not have enough troops to pursue the aims, the military objectives as set out by the Russian government. I will lay out what this mobilization means in a practical sense. I'll explain how the Russian government, in my view, reached this particular decision and ultimately what it will mean for the Ukraine war going forward. I'll also explain what I think it means for the Putin regime, which, spoiler alert, I see is in terminal decline. Vladimir Putin's leadership days, they are certainly now numbered. Now, it's also hopefully the last time I'm going to be discussing the Ukraine war for some time. There are so many other topics I've wanted to cover for the Baltic region in terms of history, culture, society, other things that are going on. And as with many aspects of daily life, this war has been a terrible disruption to the positive story and message that is coming out from this region. So I will talk about this because I think it's critical to the conflict in the coming months, but hopefully I'll be able to focus on some other issues as well. If you find value in these discussions, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you wish to support us, you can do so on Contribui. It's a Lithuanian startup, Patreon alternative. It's a great product. I'll leave a link down below for you to check it out. So what is the mobilization? Well, if you were previously in the Russian military but have left, you're being conscripted back in to provide surge capacity for the war in Ukraine. I expect a majority of those conscripted will be of two different characteristics. One, they will have had recent military experience, for example, in Syria. And two, they're likely to be outside of the major cities. This is for political reasons. If you have too many conscripts coming from Moscow and St. Petersburg, that means that when they return home after their tours with their injuries, their horror stories, they can tell about all the lies that the government has been putting through in terms of domestic propaganda, and that can accelerate revolution. This is a lesson that Vladimir Putin learned from the Chechen wars, where many of the conscripts were from the major cities, and this led to considerable unrest at home when they were being told stories that clearly did not reflect the reality. Vladimir Putin, knowing that his regime is already teetering, is going to try to avoid that. So expect a large majority of these conscripts to come from more remote areas where it's less politically affecting for Vladimir Putin at home. But the other aspect of this mobilization is arguably even more significant. Russian troops that are currently fighting in Ukraine under contract are having those contracts forcibly extended indefinitely. A large number of troops fighting in Ukraine are fighting for money. They were lured in by lucrative amounts of money, far more than they could earn in their local kind of rural areas. They would fight for a short period of time in hellish conditions, 3 to 6 months, after which they would go home if they survived, taking their windfall and setting themselves up for the future. Well, the Russian government has broken faith with all of these troops. By forcibly extending these contracts, you're telling these individuals that you're not going to be able to spend your money because you're likely to fight and die in Ukraine, and you're heading into a cold, frozen winter where you can potentially suffer through endless bombardment, which was not the deal you signed up for. This is a grave risk for the Russian military because these troops now have a strong incentive to defect. We're seeing also a sort of preemption of that. The Russian government has massively increased the penalty for defection or surrendering. However, I think under these circumstances, the low morale, the military defeats, the high probability of injury and death, and the potentially lucrative offers that the Ukrainians and the West can give to these troops should they defect with heavy equipment. So while a defecting troop takes a huge risk, they could be caught and punished. Also, they're obviously not going to be able to collect their paycheck, which will be paid exclusively in rubles. But if they have a tank, if they have a heavy armor equipment, and they defect to the West, they could be offered a bounty for this. So I would expect significant leakage among the most veteran of troops who are now dismayed at essentially being placed into indentured servitude as conscripts rather than contract fighters, mercenaries. This is on top of the other problems that the mobilization brings for Russia. It can't happen immediately. We're already seeing sold out flights to any destination that Russians can travel to without a pre-approved visa. Any flight to Istanbul, to Cyprus, they're all completely booked out. It means that Russians know that this is a losing war, they don't want to fight in the war, and they are fleeing en masse. We've also already seen, under pain of severe punishment, public protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg after Putin's address. I would also recommend that people go and review the speech that Vladimir Putin delivered when announcing the partial mobilization. I'll leave a link down below. It's extremely telling. Vladimir Putin is obviously under enormous pressure. He knows that his leadership is teetering. He's trying to satisfy many different groups of conflicting interests. You've got the ultra-nationalists who are dismayed by the failures of the Russian military on the battlefield, the huge casualties, the loss of territory. And then you've got those that are against the war totally. For example, the oligarchs who've had all their yachts impounded, are suffering under sanctions. And Vladimir Putin is blaming everybody else but himself. So he's blaming NATO for its expansion, the West for supporting Ukraine, the so-called neo-Nazis in Ukraine for not wanting a peaceful relationship with Russia. And even with the mobilization itself, Vladimir Putin said he was responding to a request from the Russian Defense Forces, i.e. this wasn't his idea, he didn't want it, and therefore if it fails, he's going to try and shift the blame to the military, which personally I think is rather unwise. But everybody can see through this, including in Russia, and so this is Putin choosing from a bunch of very bad options in the hopes to salvage something from this conflict. I don't think it's going to work, and it's just prolonging the inevitable. It really reminds me of a chess match. For example, when you've got two big grandmasters playing one another and one loses a pawn, and I don't mean in exchange for a better position or some gambit, I mean just straight up loses a bit of material. Well, the game usually ends there. One grandmaster will immediately resign, seeing that the situation is hopeless and respecting their opponent enough to be able to bring this game to its proper conclusion. Well, Russia has essentially lost a couple of pieces. The huge casualties, the failure in the strategic objectives, the loss of territory, the huge surge in support for Ukraine, the morale boost that the Ukrainians have experienced on the battlefield. Russia's military situation is essentially hopeless. But Russia is refusing to concede, Putin is refusing to concede, and is seeking to play this out. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine has already won the war. It still has to do the hard fighting. It has to make sure it doesn't get overconfident, that it must realize that Russia is looking for every opportunity to salvage something. And if you've ever played chess, you know that you're concentrating the most when you're on the back foot. You're really looking for your opportunities. And so while Ukraine, I think, has decisive military advantages at this point, it needs to understand the advantages that this mobilization could bring for Russia. Ukraine must recognize what Russia is trying to do through this mobilization and counteract it in an effective way to hasten the end of the war and hasten the demise of Vladimir Putin's Russia. So what does Russia hope to achieve from this mobilization? Well, starting with those that have been stop-lost, those that have been fighting in Ukraine under contract and have had those contracts extended, well, the Russian leadership will know that they are a defection risk, that they are not there willingly, that they're actually fighting for money, not their country. And so the Russian leadership will likely rotate them out for the winter and replace them with conscripts. Now, this is going to take some time to do because, first of all, the mobilization of these conscripts isn't going to happen overnight. The Russian government will have to pick and choose who they want. There will be many seeking to evade the draft. They'll be traveling overseas, they'll be looking for other medical exemptions, they might just go missing. And so once they're actually mobilized, identified, then they'll need to go through training to train up for the Ukrainian experience. At that point, they'll be moved in to replace those that have been fighting under contract who are the experienced soldiers, because even those that are there voluntarily who would want to extend their contracts, well, they've been there for many months. They need to be taken out so they can rest and relax and recuperate before they could be sent back. So what this means, I think, is that the Russian government is hoping to bed down for the winter. They're going to send in conscripts that are inexperienced, untrained in the Ukrainian environment, and they're going to hold positions. They won't be doing massive offensive operations where they need advanced logistical and communication skills. They'll be in fortified positions in the Ukrainian frost. The Russian leadership will be hoping that the Ukrainian military will not pursue any major offensives in the winter, that there'll be a lull in the fighting, and therefore the Russian government can take advantage of the huge manpower surge to launch a major spring offensive, seeking to retake the lost territories and then take advantage of the large numbers of troops to fortify a new front line focused in the east of the country. This strategy also has political advantages, because if the conscripts are sent to Ukraine to not do very much, if they're just in defensive holding positions in the winter when there's not much fighting, well, the conscripts will not be experiencing huge numbers of casualties, and that way domestically at home it'll be a little bit better. Of course, as I said, the stop-loss troops will be kept under a watchful eye, and then they'll be sent back into Ukraine once they've rested. They can be offered more money, and they can fight in Ukraine under slightly better conditions when we talk about warming temperatures. It's an imperative that the Ukrainian military don't allow Russia to execute this plan. Instead, and this is going to take huge risk and cost a lot in blood and treasure, but I would ask the Ukrainian government and the Western allies to look at the major offensives that might be possible during the winter months. It has a lot of upside advantages. For example, the troops that will be defending those territories, although they'll be in heavily entrenched positions with great advantage to the defenders, let's not underestimate the logistical challenges of fighting in the Ukrainian deep freeze. It's not going to be fun for the attackers. However, they'll be fighting troops that don't want to be there, that have been conscripted in against their will. They have no experience. They won't have any ability to work out how to counterattack or respond to Ukraine's flexible force. They'll be fighting seasoned combat troops that are fighting for the liberation of their country, and there is a potential for a decisive victory during the winter months. It's also something that the Russian government will not be necessarily expecting, in fact counting on not to happen. So I think every effort should be made to be able to continue high-tempo operations well into the winter months. This is a huge ask, though. It's easy for me to stand here in front of a camera and be like, yeah, sure, fight an aggressive campaign in minus 20-degree temperatures. It'll be perfectly okay. It won't be okay. It'll be a terrible grind, but it could result in a decisive victory of liberation of the rest of Ukrainian territory before the spring. It'll make any spring counteroffensive totally untenable for the Russians. The loss of these mobilized troops that have been sent forcibly to Ukraine will hasten the demise politically of Putin at home, which I said is inevitable anyway. He's owning this. There is no real way for Russia to win this war. I think the Western allies at this point are all supporting Ukraine with the most advanced equipment and technology. Ukraine's proven ability to go on offensive operations and win massive victories against the Russian forces on open battlefield has silenced any criticism that continuing to pump money and arms into Ukraine simply prolongs the war. I think Putin's talk about the specter of nuclear weapons is obviously sounding desperate. I might do another video on that in the future. As I said, there's a lot of other content I want to focus on for the time being, but I do see this mobilization as a tremendous moment of weakness in Russia. It's a concession publicly for the first time that the so-called special operation has totally failed, and Putin's rather histrionic attacks on everyone else, it makes him look extremely weak. And as a consequence, this is a moment where Ukraine can absolutely drive the nail into the coffin of the Putin regime, and I hope they pursue it to its absolute fullest. Easy for me to say. There are actual heroes on the front line who need to do the fighting and the dying to make that possible. There is nothing worse than fighting in an open plain in the dead of winter. I don't envy it, but there is a real opportunity here, and I hope they pursue it and maximally prosecute their victory. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.